I lost the case. At least, that's what everyone in that courtroom believed. The judge had just finished speaking, his voice steady, final, echoing off polished wood and marble like a verdict carved in stone. My wife, Rebecca Caldwell, sat across from me with a smile that didn't try to hide itself anymore. It was the kind of smile you only wear when you think the game is over, when you think you've already won. Her attorney leaned back, confident, fingers laced together like this was just another clean victory added to his record. Around us, people shifted in their seats, quiet murmurs filling the room like static. Papers rustled. Pens tapped. Lives, reduced to signatures and percentages. I didn't move. I didn't argue. I didn't even blink. I just sat there, hands resting loosely on the table, breathing slow, steady, like none of this surprised me. Because it didn't. The judge's words were still hanging in the air, outlining exactly how the assets would be divided, how Rebecca would walk away with what looked like the better end of everything I had spent years building. The house. The accounts. The visible pieces of a life that, on paper, looked like success. And if you were sitting in that room, watching from the gallery, you'd think the same thing they all did. That I had just been outplayed. That I had walked into a courtroom unprepared and paid the price for it. Rebecca glanced at me, just for a second, and there was something in her eyes I hadn't seen in a long time. Not anger. Not even resentment. Just quiet satisfaction. Like closing a deal she'd been working on for months. Maybe longer. And the truth is, she had been working on it. Careful questions over dinner that didn't feel like questions at the time. Casual conversations about accounts, ownership, things most couples don't think twice about. I remember those moments now, not as memories, but as pieces. Moves. Every word she had said, every detail she had asked for, it all fit together differently when you stopped looking at it as a marriage and started seeing it for what it had become. A strategy. But here's the part they couldn't see. The part no one in that courtroom could possibly understand from the outside. I wasn't sitting there defeated. I wasn't even surprised. Because the real decisions that mattered, the ones that actually decided who would walk away with what, they weren't made in that room. They weren't made when the papers were filed or when the arguments were presented. They were made months earlier, in a quiet office 3 floors above a law firm that didn't advertise and didn't need to. I remember the weight of the pen in my hand that day. Heavier than it should have been. Or maybe it just felt that way because I knew what it meant. Not just signing a document, but stepping out of the version of my life Rebecca thought she understood. Back then, I didn't say much either. I asked a few questions. Listened more than I spoke. The attorney across from me didn't waste words. Men like him never do. He just explained the structure, the timing, the implications. Clear. Precise. Final. And when I nodded, when I signed, something shifted. Quietly. Permanently. No announcement. No confrontation. Just a line crossed that no one else knew existed. So when the judge looked up from the bench and asked if there was anything further before finalizing the order, the room already believed it was over. Rebecca believed it was over. Her attorney believed it was over. Even the clerk had that look, like she was already mentally filing the case away. I felt it too. That pause. That moment where everything hangs for just a second before it settles into place. And that's when I smiled. Not wide. Not dramatic. Just enough for anyone paying close attention to realize something didn't add up. Because the truth was simple. She thought she had won the case. But the case wasn't the game. The silence after the judge spoke did not feel like relief. It felt staged, like a scene everyone had rehearsed except me, except that I had already read the script long before we walked into that courtroom. Rebecca's attorney gathered his papers with the kind of calm efficiency that comes from certainty, each document aligned, each motion deliberate, as if the outcome had been obvious from the beginning. Rebecca leaned back slightly, crossing one leg over the other, her posture relaxed. Now, almost casual, like this was just another meeting she had successfully closed. I watched her for a moment, not the way a husband looks at his wife, but the way you study a puzzle you have already solved, just to confirm every piece is exactly where it should be. The judge glanced in my direction again, waiting, giving me that final opening that most people use to object, to argue, to fight for something they believe they are losing. But I had learned something over the years. The loudest moves are rarely the strongest ones. The real ones happen quietly, long before anyone realizes the game has even started. I shifted slightly in my seat, just enough to break the stillness, and for a second, I caught the clerk looking at me, like she expected something more. People always expect a reaction when they think you have lost. Anger. Desperation. At the very least, disappointment. But there was none of that. Not anymore. Because months ago, I had already lived through that part. I had already stood in my own kitchen, late at night, staring at spreadsheets and account summaries, replaying conversations that suddenly felt different. Back then, it had not been obvious. It never is. It starts small. Questions that sound harmless. Curiosity that feels like interest. Rebecca asking about how the business was structured, how ownership worked, what was tied to what. I remember answering her, at first, like any husband would. Openly. Honestly. Believing that transparency meant trust. But there is a moment, subtle but real, when you realize the questions are not about understanding. They are about mapping. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. That was the moment everything changed for me. I did not confront her. I did not accuse her. I did something far more important. I stopped explaining. And I started thinking. The next few weeks looked normal from the outside. Same routines. Same conversations. Same dinners that felt just slightly quieter than they used to. But underneath that surface, something else was happening. I was moving pieces she did not know existed. Meetings that never showed up on my calendar. Calls taken outside instead of at my desk. Files reviewed. Not for the business, but for something much more personal. I remember the first time I walked into that law office. It did not look impressive. No skyline view. No marble floors. Just a quiet hallway, neutral walls, and a door with a name that did not need to advertise itself. The man inside did not waste time with small talk. He listened. That was the first thing I noticed. He let me speak, let me lay out everything, not just the numbers, but the pattern, the feeling that something was shifting in a direction I could not ignore. When I finished, he did not react right away. He just leaned back, folded his hands, and said something simple. If you are already being studied, then you are already in the game. The question is whether you want to play it or pretend you are not part of it. That sentence stayed with me. Because it stripped away the illusion that this was still just a marriage problem. It was not. It was strategy. And strategy requires preparation. We did not rush. That was the key. Everything was deliberate. Step by step. Structure by structure. He explained how ownership could exist without appearing where most people expect it. How assets could be positioned in ways that change what they represent on paper. It was not about hiding anything illegal. It was about understanding the rules better than the person sitting across from you. And once you understand the rules, you realize how much of the game happens outside the room where the final decision is made. Back in the courtroom, I let my hand rest on the table, fingers barely touching the edge of a folder that, to anyone else, looked like just another stack of documents. Rebecca had not looked at it once. Why would she? In her mind, everything that mattered had already been decided. She had her version of the numbers. Her attorney had confirmed them. The court had acknowledged them. From her perspective, the outcome was already real. But reality, I had learned, depends entirely on what layer you are looking at. The judge cleared his throat slightly, ready to move forward, to finalize what everyone else believed was the end. And for the first time since the ruling began, I leaned forward just a fraction, enough to signal that I was about to speak. Not to argue. Not to object. Just to place one more piece on the board. Because the game she thought she had finished had not even reached the part that mattered. I did not raise my voice when I spoke. I did not need to. The room was already quiet enough that even a breath felt loud, and when I said, "Your Honor, I have one document I would like to submit before finalization," every head in that courtroom turned just slightly, like something small had shifted beneath their feet. Rebecca's expression did not change at first. That was the interesting part. She did not panic. She did not even look concerned. She just glanced at her attorney, the same way she had all morning, trusting that whatever this was, it would be handled. That confidence told me everything I needed to know about how she saw the situation. She still believed this was a formality. Something minor. Something that would not change the direction of where this was going. The judge paused, his pen hovering above the page, then gave a small nod. "Go ahead," he said. Simple. Neutral. But it was enough. I slid the folder forward across the table, not quickly, not dramatically, just a steady motion that stopped right at the edge where my attorney could pick it up and pass it along. The paper inside looked ordinary. No bold letters. No thick stack. Just a few pages clipped together, the kind of document that would not stand out in a pile unless you knew exactly what you were looking at. Rebecca finally shifted in her seat. It was subtle, but it was there. A slight adjustment, like her body was catching up to something her mind had not fully processed yet. Her attorney took the document, scanned the first page, and for a moment, nothing happened. No reaction. No visible change. Just eyes moving left to right. And then he stopped. Not dramatically. Not abruptly. Just stopped. His posture changed first. The relaxed lean disappeared, replaced by something tighter, more focused. He flipped to the next page, then back again, as if confirming what he was seeing. Rebecca leaned in slightly, whispering something under her breath, probably asking what it was. Probably expecting a quick answer. He did not respond right away. That was the first real crack. The judge noticed it too. You could tell by the way he adjusted his glasses and extended his hand for the document. When it reached him, he read it slower than the attorney had. Deliberate. Careful. The kind of reading that does not skim, that does not assume. And while he read, the room changed. Not louder. Not chaotic. Just heavier. Like the air itself was waiting. I kept my hands still on the table, fingers relaxed, because this part was not about movement. It was about letting the weight of the truth settle exactly where it needed to. Rebecca's voice came again, a little less controlled this time, asking what was going on, asking why no one was saying anything. Her attorney finally leaned toward her, speaking low enough that most people could not hear, but I did not need to hear the words. I saw the reaction. Confusion first. Then disbelief. Then that small, almost invisible shake of the head people give when something does not fit the version of reality they have already accepted. "That is not possible," she said louder now, enough for the judge to look up. Her composure did not shatter. It shifted. Like glass under pressure, not broken, but no longer stable. The judge placed the document down for a moment, looking directly at me. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, his tone measured, "why was this not introduced earlier in the proceedings?" It was a fair question. The kind that assumes something has been held back. And in a way it had. I met his gaze, calm, steady, the same way I had been from the start. "Because, Your Honor," I said, "it only became relevant when the division was presented as final." There was a pause after that. Not long, but long enough. The judge looked back at the document, then at Rebecca, then at her attorney, who now looked very different from the man who had been organizing his papers just minutes ago. This was not about arguing anymore. It was about structure. About ownership. About what existed on paper versus what existed in reality. Rebecca shook her head again, this time more firmly. "No," she said, her voice tighter. "That is not how this works. That is not what we agreed on. That is not what was disclosed." And there it was. Not anger. Not yet. Just the realization that the foundation she had built her entire case on might not be as solid as she believed. I did not interrupt her. I did not correct her. I just let her speak, because sometimes the truth does not need to be explained. It just needs to be revealed at the right moment. And as the judge turned another page, as the silence deepened again, it became clear to everyone in that room that this was no longer about who won the case they had just heard. It was about something else entirely. Something that had been decided long before any of them ever walked into that courtroom. The judge did not speak right away, and that silence carried more weight than anything that had been said so far. He read the document again, slower this time, as if each line required confirmation, as if the meaning behind the words needed to be tested before it could be accepted. Rebecca's attorney leaned closer, trying to follow along, but the shift in his posture told the story before any words were exchanged. This was no longer routine. This was no longer controlled. Rebecca's voice came again, sharper now, edged with something that had not been there before. "What is that document?" she asked, not to me, but to her attorney, to the room, to anyone who could give her an answer that would restore the version of reality she had walked in with. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he exhaled slowly, a small but unmistakable sign that the ground beneath him had changed. "Your Honor," he began, more carefully now, "we would need a moment to review the implications of this filing." The judge nodded once, but he did not grant a recess. He did not need to. The implication was already unfolding in real time. "You may review it," the judge said, his tone steady, "but we will proceed." That was when Rebecca finally looked directly at me. Not past me. Not through me. At me. And for the first time since this process began, there was no confidence in her expression. Just a question she could not yet form into words. I held her gaze for a second, then let it go, not out of avoidance, but because this was not about confrontation. It was about understanding, and understanding does not always come from direct answers. It comes from watching something unfold piece by piece until there is no other conclusion left. Months earlier, sitting in that quiet office, I had asked a simple question. What happens if everything she is building her case on does not technically belong to me? The attorney across from me did not hesitate. Then she is not dividing what she thinks she is dividing, he said. That answer had seemed almost too simple at the time. Too clean. But simplicity is often what makes something powerful. The document now sitting in the judge's hands was the result of that simplicity. A structure that existed within the law, fully compliant, fully documented, but positioned in a way that changed the entire framework of what could be considered marital property. It was not hidden. It was not secret. It was simply not where anyone thought to look. Back in the courtroom, the judge placed the document down and folded his hands for a moment, considering. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, "this indicates that a significant portion of the assets referenced in these proceedings are held within a trust established prior to the filing of this case." His words were measured, but the effect was immediate. Rebecca shook her head again, faster this time, like she could undo what she was hearing just by refusing to accept it. "That is not correct," she said, her voice rising just enough to break the controlled tone she had maintained all morning. "Those assets were disclosed. They were presented. They are part of the marital estate." The judge looked at her, not dismissively, but with the kind of patience that comes from knowing something must be explained carefully. "They were disclosed," he said, "but ownership structure matters. And based on this documentation, the structure is different than what has been argued." Her attorney stepped in then, more urgently now. "Your Honor, we would challenge the timing of this structure and whether it was established in good faith." That was expected. It was the only move left. Challenge the intent. Question the timing. Suggest that something was done to avoid the outcome she had been pursuing. The judge nodded again, acknowledging the point, then looked back down at the document. "That may be addressed," he said, "but the existence of the structure itself is not in question. It is valid. It is documented. And it has legal standing." The words settled over the room like a quiet shift in gravity. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just undeniable. Rebecca leaned back slowly, her hands gripping the edge of the table now, not tightly, but enough to show that something inside her had shifted from control to calculation. She was trying to reassemble the board in her mind, trying to understand where this piece had come from, when it had been placed, and how she had not seen it. I could see it in her eyes. The realization was not immediate. It came in layers. First confusion. Then resistance. Then the slow, uncomfortable recognition that the picture she had been working from was incomplete. I did not interrupt that process. I did not explain it. Because this was the part that mattered most. Not the document itself, but the moment when someone understands that the outcome they believed was certain, was built on an assumption they never thought to question. And as the judge prepared to speak again, as the structure of the case began to shift in a direction no one had anticipated, it became clear that what had just been introduced was not a minor detail. It was the foundation. And without it, everything that came before it meant something very different. Rebecca's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the table, not enough for anyone across the room to notice, but enough for me to see the shift. It was not panic yet. It was recalculation. The kind that happens when someone realizes the numbers they trusted no longer add up the way they expected. Her attorney leaned closer again, flipping through the document with more urgency now, scanning for something, anything, that could challenge what was sitting in front of him. But the problem with structure is that once it is properly built, it does not rely on interpretation. It stands on its own. The judge adjusted his glasses once more, his attention moving between the pages and the notes already in front of him, comparing, aligning, measuring what had been argued against what now existed in black and white. This trust, he said slowly, almost thinking out loud, was established prior to the filing of the dissolution. It lists a separate holding entity as the managing body, with distribution terms that are not subject to direct division under standard marital property rules. The words were technical, but the meaning underneath them was simple. The assets Rebecca thought she was dividing were not positioned to be divided the way she believed. That cannot be right, Rebecca said again, but this time the certainty was gone. It was replaced with something quieter, something that sounded more like disbelief than denial. Her attorney straightened, clearing his throat slightly, trying to regain control of the narrative. Your Honor, even if such a structure exists, we would argue that the intent behind its formation is critical. If it was created to circumvent equitable distribution, then it should be subject to review and possible adjustment. It was the correct argument. It was also the only one left. Challenge intent. Question motive. Suggest manipulation. But intent is a difficult thing to prove when everything is documented, timed, and executed within the boundaries of the law. The judge nodded again, acknowledging the point, but his expression did not shift. Intent can be examined, he said, but the burden of proof rests on demonstrating that the structure violates legal standards. At this point, the documentation supports its validity. The room settled into a different kind of silence. Not the kind that comes from anticipation, but the kind that comes from realization. Rebecca leaned back slowly, her eyes moving from the judge to the document, then to me, as if she was trying to find the missing piece in my expression. Something that would explain how this had happened without her seeing it. I did not give her that. I kept my face neutral, my posture unchanged, because the explanation was not something that could be summarized in a single moment. It was built over time, piece by piece, decision by decision. Months earlier, I had sat in that same quiet office, listening as the attorney outlined not just the structure, but the reasoning behind it. People think assets are defined by what they see, he had said. Accounts, properties, balances. But legally, assets are defined by how they are held, not just what they are. That distinction had changed everything for me. It meant that the visible layer of my life, the one Rebecca had been studying, questioning, mapping out, was only part of the equation. The real control existed beneath that layer, in the way ownership was structured, in the way access was defined, in the way distribution was governed. And once that structure was in place, it did not matter how the surface was presented. The foundation determined the outcome. Back in the courtroom, Rebecca's attorney flipped to another page, then another, his movements more deliberate now, less confident. He was no longer presenting a case. He was trying to understand one that had already been set. "We would request time to further review this structure," he said finally, his tone measured but noticeably different from before. The judge considered that for a moment, then nodded. "A brief recess will be granted," he said. The gavel tapped lightly, not as a dramatic conclusion, but as a pause. A moment to allow the reality of what had just been introduced to settle in. People began to shift in their seats, quiet conversation starting to form, but I remained where I was, hands still resting on the table, eyes forward. Rebecca did not move right away. She stayed seated, staring at the document now in her attorney's hands, as if looking at it long enough might change what it said. Then, slowly, she stood, turning toward him, her voice low but urgent, asking questions that did not have simple answers anymore. I watched her for a moment, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with clarity. Because this was the part that most people misunderstand. It was never about taking something from her. It was about protecting what I had built from being defined by someone else's expectations. And as the courtroom emptied for the recess, as the noise of uncertainty replaced the confidence that had filled the room just minutes earlier, one thing became clear. The outcome she had walked in expecting was no longer guaranteed. Not because of an argument. Not because of emotion. But because the game she thought she understood was built on rules she had never fully seen. The hallway outside the courtroom felt colder than it should have, even though nothing about the temperature had changed. People moved in low voices, attorneys leaning into quiet conversations, clients asking questions that did not have immediate answers. Rebecca stood a few feet away from me, turned slightly toward her attorney, her posture no longer relaxed, no longer certain. She was listening now, not directing, not assuming. Listening the way people do when they realize they may have missed something important. Her attorney spoke in measured tones, pointing at sections of the document, flipping pages back and forth as if repetition might reveal a flaw that was not there the first time. I stayed where I was, leaning lightly against the wall, hands in my pockets, watching without staring. There was no need to approach. No need to engage. This part was not about confrontation. It was about absorption. Letting the reality settle in without interference. Months earlier, I had asked another question in that office, one that mattered more than anything else. What happens if she challenges it? The attorney did not hesitate then either. She will, he said. That is predictable. The question is not whether she challenges it. The question is whether the challenge has ground to stand on. That was the difference between reacting and preparing. Anyone can react. Anyone can argue once the problem is visible. But preparation means building something that holds even when it is tested. That was what we had done. Not rushed. Not hidden. Just structured with intention. Rebecca's voice carried slightly now, sharper than before, though still controlled. You are telling me this changes everything? She asked. Her attorney paused before answering, and that pause said more than anything else. It changes how the assets are categorized, he replied. Carefully. And that changes how they can be divided. She shook her head again, slower this time, as if she was trying to align that explanation with everything she had believed up until this moment. But we reviewed everything, she said. We went through every account, every property, every... She stopped herself, the sentence trailing off not because she ran out of words, but because she ran into a realization. They had reviewed everything they could see. Everything that was presented in the way they expected. But expectation is not the same as reality. I looked down the hallway for a moment, letting my eyes settle on nothing in particular, and remembered the last meeting before everything was finalized. The attorney had slid the final documents across the desk, the same calm expression he always carried. Once this is executed, he said, it becomes part of the structure. Not a reaction to what happens next. A foundation for it. That distinction mattered more than anything. Because timing defines intent. And intent defines how something is judged. I had signed without hesitation that day, not because I felt confident, but because I understood what was at stake. Not just the assets, not just the numbers, but the control over how my life would be defined moving forward. Back in the hallway, Rebecca's attorney continued explaining, his tone shifting between technical and careful, choosing words that were accurate but not inflammatory. He was not trying to alarm her. He was trying to ground her. But grounding only works when someone is willing to accept the ground they are standing on has changed. Rebecca crossed her arms, not defensively, but tightly, like she was holding something in place. Her eyes moved again briefly toward me. Not long enough to invite a reaction. Just long enough to confirm that I was still there, still calm, still exactly where she had left me before everything shifted. That calm unsettles people more than anything else. Not because it is aggressive, but because it suggests certainty where uncertainty is expected. The bailiff stepped out into the hallway, his voice steady, calling everyone back in. The recess was over. Conversations cut short. Papers gathered. The movement back into the courtroom felt different than before. Slower. More deliberate. Like everyone understood they were walking into a situation that was no longer predictable. I took my seat again without rushing, placing my hands on the table the same way I had before. Nothing changed on the surface. Rebecca sat across from me, but this time her posture was not relaxed. It was attentive. Focused. The judge returned, settling into his seat, the room quieting almost immediately. He looked at both sides, then down at the document again, as if confirming that nothing about it had changed in the last few minutes. It had not. Structures like that do not change under pressure. They reveal themselves. And as he prepared to continue, as the next phase of the decision began to take shape, it was clear that whatever confidence had existed at the start of the day had been replaced with something else entirely. Not fear. Not yet. But the unmistakable awareness that the outcome was no longer something you could assume. It was something you had to face piece by piece, whether you were ready for it or not. When the judge resumed speaking, his tone had shifted in a way that most people would not notice unless they were listening for it. It was no longer just procedural. It carried weight now, the kind that comes when a decision is no longer about applying standard expectations, but about interpreting something that changes the framework entirely. Having reviewed the submitted documentation, he began, his eyes moving briefly between both sides of the room. The court must now reassess the classification of the assets previously presented. The words were measured, but they landed with precision. Rebecca sat perfectly still, her focus locked on the judge, not interrupting, not reacting outwardly, but her stillness was different now. It was not confidence. It was control. The kind you hold onto when you are waiting to see exactly how much ground is about to shift beneath you. Her attorney leaned forward, ready, prepared to respond, but he did not interrupt either. He was waiting. Calculating. Because at this point, timing mattered more than volume. The judge continued, referencing specific sections of the document, outlining how the trust structure affected ownership, how the holding entity separated certain assets from direct marital classification. It was not a dramatic explanation. It did not need to be. The clarity was enough. As it stands, the judge said, these assets are not subject to division in the manner previously argued, due to their current legal positioning. That was the moment everything settled. Not loudly. Not visibly. But definitively. Rebecca's lips parted slightly, as if she was about to speak, then closed again. It was a small moment, easy to miss, but it carried more weight than anything she could have said. Because it was the moment she understood. Not fully, not all at once, but enough. Enough to realize that the outcome she had been building toward was no longer aligned with the structure in front of her. Her attorney spoke then, stepping in with controlled urgency. Your Honor, we would request a full evaluation of the timing and formation of this trust, including its intent and any potential implications regarding equitable considerations. The argument was expected. It was necessary. But even as he spoke, there was a difference in his tone. It was no longer confident. It was careful. The judge nodded, acknowledging the request. That may be pursued, he said. But based on the current documentation, the structure itself is valid and enforceable. The court cannot disregard it without sufficient legal basis. That line closed more doors than it opened. Rebecca leaned back slowly, her hands now resting flat on the table, no longer gripping the edge. Her posture had changed again. Not relaxed, not tense, just still. Like she was holding everything in place while she processed what it meant. I watched her for a moment, not with satisfaction, not with resentment, but with a kind of quiet distance. Because this was not about winning in the way people usually think about it. It was not about taking something away from her. It was about making sure what I had built was not reduced to something it was never meant to be. Months ago, I had understood something that changed everything for me. You do not wait until the final moment to protect what matters. You do it long before anyone realizes there is something to protect. That is what this was. Not a reaction. A preparation. The judge continued, moving now toward recalculating the division based on what remained within the marital estate. The numbers changed. The percentages shifted. What had once looked like a clear outcome began to take on a different shape entirely. Rebecca's attorney adjusted his papers again, following along, adapting as best as possible, but adaptation only works when you have time. And time was the one thing that no longer existed in the way it had before. The room felt different now. Not tense. Not chaotic. Just aware. Everyone understood that what they were witnessing was not a reversal caused by argument, but a revelation caused by structure. And structure does not negotiate. It defines. When the judge paused again, preparing to finalize the revised terms, he looked up once more, giving both sides the opportunity to respond. Rebecca did not speak. Not immediately. She looked at her attorney, then back at the judge, then down at the table, where the document still rested, unchanged, unaffected by the weight of everything around it. That was the final shift. Not in the ruling, but in the understanding of it. Because in that moment, it was no longer about what she thought she had won. It was about what had never truly been hers to claim in the first place. The judge lowered his gaze back to the documents in front of him, and when he spoke again, there was no hesitation left in his voice. The court will proceed with the revised division based on the confirmed ownership structure, he said, each word steady, deliberate, final in a way that did not invite argument, only acceptance. The numbers that followed were different now. Not dramatically altered in tone, not announced with any sense of spectacle, but fundamentally changed in outcome. What Rebecca had expected to walk away with was no longer aligned with the reality being outlined. The portions of the estate that remained subject to division were smaller, more limited, clearly defined. The rest, the part that had once made her so certain, now existed outside the reach of this process entirely. Rebecca did not interrupt. She did not object. She sat there, eyes fixed forward, listening as the details were read out, her expression controlled but no longer composed in the way it had been at the beginning. There is a difference between composure and control. Composure is what you show when everything is going according to plan. Control is what you hold on to when it is not. Her attorney made a final attempt, not to challenge the structure itself, but to soften the impact. Your Honor, he said, choosing his words carefully, we would request consideration for equitable adjustment based on the duration of the marriage and the contributions made during that time. It was a reasonable request. It always is. But reason does not override structure. The judge acknowledged it with a slight nod. Those factors have been considered within the portion of the estate subject to division, he replied. However, the court cannot extend that consideration beyond the legal boundaries established by the ownership framework. That was the closing line. Not loud. Not harsh. Just definitive. Rebecca's shoulders lowered slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition. The kind that does not happen all at once, but settles in gradually, like something heavy finding its place. She looked down at the table for a moment, then back up, her eyes no longer searching for answers, but absorbing what had already been decided. I remained still, the same way I had been from the start, not because I was unaffected, but because this moment had already passed for me long before we entered this room. The outcome was not something I was discovering now. It was something I had prepared for, step by step, choice by choice, long before it became visible to anyone else. The judge finalized the order with a final statement, his pen moving across the page with a quiet certainty that marked the end of the process. "This concludes the court's ruling," he said. The sound of the gavel followed, light but unmistakable, signaling that what had just been decided was no longer open to interpretation. Around us, people began to move again, chairs shifting, papers being gathered, voices returning in low tones as the room transitioned from tension to closure. Rebecca remained seated for a second longer than everyone else, her hands resting flat against the table, as if grounding herself in something that no longer felt stable. Then, slowly, she stood. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. Just, deliberately. Her attorney spoke to her quietly, likely explaining next steps, options, possibilities that now looked very different than they had an hour ago. She nodded once, but her attention drifted again, briefly, in my direction. This time, there was no question in her eyes. No confusion. Just understanding. Not complete. Not comfortable. But enough. I gathered my own papers without urgency, sliding the folder closed, placing it back where it belonged. To anyone watching, it would look like the end of a standard proceeding. Two people separating their lives, a court deciding the terms, everyone moving on. But that was only true on the surface. Beneath that, something else had happened. Not a reversal driven by emotion. Not a victory declared in the moment. Just the quiet confirmation that the real outcome had been decided long before this room ever came into the equation. As I stood and turned toward the exit, I did not look back right away. There was no need. Some things do not require acknowledgement to be real. But as I reached the doorway, I paused for just a second, not out of hesitation, but out of clarity. Because in that moment, more than anything else, I understood something that had taken me months to accept. The end of this was not defined by what was taken or what was left behind. It was defined by what remained untouched, protected, and entirely mine to carry forward. I stepped out of the courtroom into the late afternoon light, and for a moment, everything felt quieter than it should have. Not because the world had changed, but because something inside me had finally settled. The noise of the past months, the constant tension of not knowing how things would unfold, the quiet calculations that ran in the background of every conversation, every decision, every sleepless night. It all seemed to fade into something distant, like a storm that had already passed but left the ground permanently altered. The courthouse steps stretched out in front of me, concrete warm under the sun, people moving up and down with their own cases, their own stories, their own versions of what they thought mattered. I walked down slowly, not rushing, not pausing, just moving forward in a way that felt natural for the first time in a long while. Behind me, somewhere inside that building, Rebecca was still there, still processing, still trying to reconcile the version of events she had believed in with the reality that had just been finalized. I did not feel the need to go back. There was nothing left to say that had not already been decided. Months ago, when everything first began to shift, I had thought this would feel different. I had imagined something sharper, something louder. A moment of clear victory or loss. But standing there now, I realized it was neither. It was quieter than that. More grounded. Because this was never about proving something to her. It was about understanding something for myself. I reached the bottom of the steps and paused for a second, looking out at the street, at the steady flow of cars, the rhythm of a city that did not stop for anyone's personal battles. Life moved on, whether you were ready or not. That was the truth I had been avoiding for a long time. Not the legal outcome, not the division of assets, but the idea that control is not something you claim in a moment. It is something you build over time, often without anyone noticing until it is already in place. I thought back to that first night when the questions started to feel different, when the small details no longer seemed casual, when the tone of our conversations carried something beneath the surface that I could not ignore. At the time, It had felt like the beginning of something breaking. And in a way, it was. But it was also the beginning of something else. Something I had not recognized then, but understood now. The moment you realize that the rules you have been playing by are not the only ones that exist, you have a choice. You can keep playing the same game, hoping it turns in your favor, or you can step back, learn the structure, and decide how you want to move within it. I had made that choice quietly. Not out of anger. Not out of revenge. But out of clarity. And that clarity was what carried me through everything that followed. I walked toward the parking lot, the sound of my footsteps steady against the pavement, the air carrying that late-day warmth that lingers just before evening settles in. There was no sense of urgency in me. No need to check my phone, no need to replay what had just happened. Because the outcome was no longer something I needed to process. It was something I had already accepted long before it became visible. I reached my car, unlocking it with a small click that sounded louder than it should have in the quiet around me. As I opened the door, I caught my reflection briefly in the window. Not dramatically different. Not transformed into someone else. Just clearer. Like a version of myself that had shed something unnecessary without losing anything that mattered. I sat down, resting my hands on the steering wheel for a moment before starting the engine, letting the stillness settle one last time. Because this was the part no one talks about. Not the courtroom. Not the documents. Not the outcome. But the moment after, when everything is done, and you are left with whatever remains. And what remained for me was simple. Not the numbers. Not the assets. Not the structure that had protected them. But the understanding that the real game had never been about what was visible. It was about what was built beneath it. And that was something no ruling could take away. As I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, merging into the flow of traffic, I did not look back. Not because I was trying to leave something behind, but because there was nothing left there that belonged to me anymore. The road ahead stretched out, steady and open, and for the first time in a long time, I was not thinking about what I had lost or what I had kept. I was thinking about what I had learned. And that was the only part that truly mattered.